Welcome to Superhero Pow. I'm your host nerd, Tom Fremgen. Today I want to shout at the clouds about the Bronze Age of comics and how it's just plain wrong. You see, when you talk about comic book history, you always break things down into ages. The Silver Age, the Gold Age, the Modern Age, etc. For the longest time, the age after the Silver Age has been called the Bronze Age. Well, what a load of crap. And I'll tell you why. First off, the Golden Age and the Silver Age don't sit next to each other, so why should the Silver and the Bronze? Also, the Golden and Silver Ages both had dramatic effects on superheroes, creating them and then reinventing them. But this 70s Bronze Age? Pfft, nothing. Lastly, I see the gold, silver, and bronze like Olympic medals. I assume I can't be the only one. And I'll be damned if the 70s is getting the bronze. So who deserves the Bronze Age, you ask? The 1980s. After the 1940s and the 1960s, the 1980s was the biggest decade for superheroes and comic books. Now, for the record, let's mark the ages as I see them. While there's always spillover, I typically group them as decades. So even though the Golden Age really started in either 1935 with the first issue of More Fun, which was the first comic book to have material specifically created for the comic book, as opposed to just reprinting newspaper strips, or maybe 1938, the first issue of Action Comics, Superman and all that. But for simplicity's sake, let's just say this. The 1940s is the Golden Age, the birth of comics and superheroes. The 1950s is the Atomic Age, the rise of sci-fi, monsters, and the death of superheroes. The 1960s is the Silver Age, with the rebirth of superheroes and, of course, the age within an age, the Marvel Age. The 1970s is the Recession Age. As with the rest of the economy, the comic industry was in bad shape. The 1980s is now the Bronze Age, the superhero relaunches, post-crisis. The 1990s is the Dark Age, all about gimmicks and grimness. As for the 2000s and the 2010s, I'm not too sure. It's all kind of a malaise in my head still. Do you have a good name for them? And of course, the 2020s is the Modern Age, because whatever decade we're in is the Modern Age. Unless if you want to do something like, it's the Postmodern Age, because people first started to use the Modern Age in the 80s and the 90s, so this could be the Postmodern Age. But I'm really getting in the weeds now, so let's move on. First off, I'll assume you're asking, okay, Tom, what the heck is the Recession Age? Well, relatively speaking, there were all kinds of comic books in the Golden Age. Yes, superheroes were king, but you also had horror, romance, western, war, and funny animal books as well. When superheroes were dying out like a fad in the Atomic Age, horror, romance, westerns, war, and funny animal books all continued to sell. Mind you, the whole market was in a slump after the whole seduction of the innocent nonsense too. Then in the Silver Age, as superheroes became king again, horror, romance, westerns, war, and funny animal books still continued to sell. As the Recession Age hit, superheroes became more than king. They became like the only game in town. Hardest hit in the 70s was the romance titles. Secret Hearts, Young Love, Girl Romance, Girls in Love, I Love You, Love Diary, Romantic Stories, Sweethearts, Time for Love, Young Romance, and others all came to an end in the 1970s. Science fiction, westerns, funny animals, and others weren't doing so hot either. The dominance of superheroes was so strong that everything else was shutting down. Mind you, just like superheroes in the 1950s, these other genres weren't completely gone. DC's Jonah Hex and Sergeant Rock kept westerns and army stories going. Harvey still limped along with Casper and Richie Rich. And while Marvel's top seller, Mindy the Model, finally called it quits after 28 years, Archie Comics pressed on. The 1970s is also known for DC's infamous blunder, the DC implosion, Within 1 year, DC canceled 31 titles, many non-superhero ones. It was called the implosion because it happened just after DC launched a bunch of new titles, again several non-superhero titles, called the DC explosion. So in light of all that, I'm sure not giving the 1970s the bronze medal. And just like the economy at the time in the United States, I dub it the recession age. This brings us to the new Bronze Age, the 1980s. This is when DC and Marvel superheroes were given a kick in the pants, making them exciting and new again, just like they were in the Golden Age and the Silver Age. It also has spillover like the 1940s Golden Age, starting in either 1935 or 1938, and the 1960s Silver Age, starting in 1955 with the relaunch of The Flash and Showcase. So the Bronze Age really got started in 1975 with Marvel's giant-size X-Men #1, turning the failing X-Men comic into the biggest comic book around, revamping old characters and creating a bunch of new ones. DC followed up in 1980 with the new Teen Titans, again becoming one of the biggest hits of the decade, revamping old characters and creating new exciting ones. Next, DC really unloaded with a complete relaunch of their whole universe in 1985's Crisis on the Infinite Earths. Oddly enough, the characters who were changed the most were the characters who were changed the least in the Silver Age: Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. DC Comics, which had just about been sitting in neutral since the Silver Age, now had the hottest books on the shelf. They brought in the British invasion writers Grant Morrison, Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman, and others, many who looked at the superhero dominance of the recession age and turned the superhero concept on its ear, with the likes of Swamp Thing, The Watchmen, and Animal Man. Marvel, while still the king of comics, led by their own British writer Chris Claremont on X-Men, also took this time to explore and relaunch their heroes, although they did not meet with the success that DC did. Captain America became the Captain, Thor became a frog, then he grew a beard, covered himself in armor, and was replaced by Beta Ray Bill. Iron Man went from the Golden Avenger to the Silver Avenger. Now, this might not seem like much, but remember, these characters were pretty much untouched since the Silver Age. So while not too popular or long-lasting, it's still noteworthy. The biggest thing Marvel tried, much to their chagrin, was the new universe. Just as DC got rid of all their parallel Earths, Marvel created their most infamous one, knocking out 8 new titles like Starbrand, Nightmask, DP7, and Kickers Inc., none of whom made it past 35 issues. Still, their fans will tell you they were just ahead of their time. Another good thing for the comic book industry, at least for the time, was the rise of comic book stores. Unlike newspaper stands or grocery stores, these merchants actually bought the comics from the publisher at wholesale prices and then basically resold them to us fans. If they couldn't sell an issue, they had to eat the cost, because they couldn't send it back to the publisher and get their money back, or rather credit on their next order. This was instant sales for the publishers, so they loved it. Although it would backfire in the long run with the loss of wider distribution. But it was great for the time. Another positive to come out of the comic book store was the healthy indie market. Mind you, there was always some form of an indie market, but in the 1980s, where comic book stores had to purchase issues up front, fans knew they could find the next issues there. So smaller companies like Pacific, Comico, Eclipse, First, and Dark Horse all did pretty well for themselves. So that's my argument to make the 1980s the new Bronze Age. When does the age end? Well, like always, it's a moving target. It could be when DC launched Vertigo in 1993, or when they killed Superman in 1992, or maybe when Marvel's new universe went belly up in 1989. Or you could even peg 1992 again with the creation of Image Comics. But think for yourself now. Is the 1970s really worth being called the Bronze Age? Or should we start calling the 1980s the Bronze Age? Are you with me? Well, if not, thanks for listening anyway. And be sure to let me know why you think I'm wrong. And as always, if you could be so kind to like, subscribe, and notify, I won't have to rub printer ink all over my body and leap into a swimming pool filled with newsprint. It's too hard to explain.